Hi, so I'm going to be starting a new experiment, I suppose, and it's inspired in some sense by my last video where I was responding to an article critiquing Slavoj Žižek, where I just got the sense that, reflective, higher order dialogue is not only something that's necessary for the culture, but it's actually a really interesting way and potentially a philosophical tool to approach problems in a new way. And of course, with the internet, with all sorts of different communication mediums and different long form discussions, which are emerging as cultural drivers, I thought maybe engaging in some of these in a dialectical way could be something useful for the channel, something productive for people who follow this channel. And my first experiment with this is going to be with a recent Joe Rogan interview, which was released on October 22nd, where Joe Rogan is actually talking with Richard Dawkins about religion and his new book, Outgrowing God. And I've followed Richard Dawkins' career. I've been influenced by Richard Dawkins. If you're interested more in my background, engaging with his work, I can leave some links in the description. But basically, my views have evolved dramatically on what I think about Richard Dawkins. And I want to use this video here and this interview here that he had with Joe Rogan as a way to work through some of the problematics of new atheism, and specifically Dawkins' use of evolutionary theory to critique religion, which I actually think, now I'm going to try and be very nuanced, and I'm going to try and be very, question-oriented and mystery-oriented, but to try to use this as a way to, I would say my overall goal with this video is to search out the logical space where either a science of religion or a logical relationship to religion can be articulated in an academic way, which is honest, intellectually invigorating, and opening us on to new questions about phenomenology, about the nature of reality, and the potential future of a philosophy of religion. So that's the goal of this video, and I've just got some quotes and snippets from the interview with Rogan, which I'm going to highlight and then give sort of my reflective consideration on, and hopefully this is a useful tool for you to engage in these questions about the nature of religion. And so let's start. I'm going to start here with a passage from 438 where Joe Rogan's asking, why do you think every civilization has had some form of deity or higher power?
It's amazing the way they split and diverge and diverge and diverge. It's as though they somehow can't get along with each other, and maybe new leaders arise who have a leadership complex or something and want to found their own sect. Time and time again you have breakaway religions, breakaway faiths. I don't know what the psychological reason for it is, but what I have noticed is that they usually hate the religion which is the closest to their own more than they do more distant ones, and that has a certain biological ring to it too.
So the first thing about this response is when Rogan's asking, why do you think every civilization has had some form of deity or higher power? And then he says, I don't know what the psychological reason is. That's the first interesting statement, which is like if you spend your entire career critiquing religion, but then you don't know the psychological reason why every civilization has had some form of deity or higher power, then that signals to me like a huge gap in our ability to critique religion. like, if we're going to critique religion, I think one of the first steps would be to have a sophisticated psychological understanding for why religions appear so necessary in the history of civilizations, and why they appear as ontological facts. It could be that there's psychical principles, it could be that there's psychical mechanisms which our minds are predisposed to, which would be important to understand at the foundation before we critique or we presuppose that religions are inherently bad or evil, or that they should be done away with, as opposed to being transformed or reformed or understood in a different way. And then in regards to his statement about religions disliking other religions which are closer to them phylogenetically, or I get in a phylogenetic type of model, I'm not sure that has a biological ring to it. Because isn't it like, the closer a species is phylogenetically, the more, like, it's not the phylogenetic relatedness of a species which will lead a species to hate or to become antagonistic internal to that dynamic. So, like, I mean, I'm going to give a maybe a silly example, but for me, I have a spontaneous affinity to other mammals. I like other mammals, and if other mammals are close to me in many contexts, it's quite agreeable to me. But organisms which are more phylogenetically distant from me, reptiles, insects, to me are repellent in almost every context. I'm not saying that's universal, that all humans feel that way, but just that closeness of biological relatedness doesn't lead to antagonism. So it's I don't understand his reasoning on why certain religions would hate each other if they're more closely related to each other. Like, for example, Christianity and Islam is maybe a good example of that. Where they are actually closely related phylogenetically, and it seems like it seems kind of like a mystery of I would frame it as a mystery on the level of the symbolic order, or a mystery on the level of history and language that maybe we don't understand too well, which is that symbolic social systems tend to be universalizing and become hegemonic. So, if and all or nothing. So, like, if the Christian system is true, then it has to be totally true, universally true for all human beings. And if the Islamic system is true, it has to be universally true for all human beings. And so that would naturally create an antagonism, whereas there might not be the same antagonism with more distant religious systems which don't necessarily have, competing interests with each other. So those are my first thoughts on that. Then Rogan asks him, maybe religion is a natural part of being a human being.
Right, that they put an enormous amount of energy and effort and expense and time and cost in share. I mean, some of the extreme sects which whip themselves with horrible weapons, actually bleed,
Yes.
Scar their own backs. It's very, very surprising to a biologist. We would think that they would be more interested in surviving and reproducing, but no, there's something about religion that makes them go to extremes of costliness, and I don't get it, I must say.
So again, there's an interesting phenomenon as related to religion, where he's again saying simply that he doesn't get it. So it seems to me again that this critique of religion is not sufficiently grounded in an understanding of the phenomenon. So because if you apply the same logic to physics or biology, like not getting something doesn't mean the thing is inherently untrue or inherently without value to investigate. So like, for example, the example he gave is people sort of harming themselves biologically, or people harming their own survival and reproduction interests from the perspective of an evolutionary theorist. But then that could mean that evolutionary theory, although applicable to human beings in a biological sense, is not a total theory of human behavior, or is not a total theory of why humans, the motives, the why and the desires of why humans do the things they do. Like, it's not 100% clear to me. Like, it's clear to me that evolutionary theory has a very strong ability to explain why humans appeared in the world and why the world exists as it does. But it's not clear to me that evolutionary theory, as it's currently described in a neo-Darwinian framework, can explain the relationship specifically between the symbolic order and the biological order, for example. Like, it's not clear to me why, for example, humans will go to extreme lengths to stop reproducing, for example. And humans do this in many different contexts. And it's not only in religious contexts or stereotypically religious contexts. And it's also not clear to me why humans would go to extreme lengths to, for example, die for a cause, which would not be in their best survival interests. So when it comes to things like survival and reproduction and these behaviors being strange to an evolutionary biologist, it might not be that there's something untrue about the religious subject. It might be that evolutionary biology as a causal explanation for their behavior is insufficient. And it would bring up the question of more, why do these people behave this way? Why do people behave in ways that are counter to their survival imperative? And why do people behave in ways that are counter to their reproductive imperative from the perspective of an evolutionary biologist? Again, it brings up to me questions about the nature of the symbolic order, which Dawkins here is saying, I just simply don't understand. So then Rogan comes up with a question of, do you think that religion is emerged because we're a finite entity and we struggle with our finitude because we're self-conscious, because we're thinking beings? 650.
That's right. I can understand why people might want to believe a priest who comes along and tells them you don't have to worry about death because you're going to survive it. I'm less understanding of people who make up stories to comfort either themselves or other people. I mean, a made-up story should not be comforting. I don't understand how a made-up story can be comforting. Of course, if you make it up and persuade somebody else, then they could find it comforting. On the other hand, is an afterlife really all that comforting? When you think about, half of them believe they're going to go to hell, so it's anything but comforting. And also, even if you're not going to hell, if you're going to heaven, eternity in heaven, I mean, sitting in heaven for not just billions of years, but trillions of years. I mean, these are time spans beyond our comprehension. How unbelievably boring it would be.
Okay, so this is an interesting one, which is, like, his first query is, made-up stories are not that comforting. So, the made-up story isn't going to protect you from death, or isn't going to protect you from the truth, basically. And that, some stories are actually not that comforting, stories about hell. And then says, even if the story is true, wouldn't eternity in heaven be boring? I mean, there's so much here that's strange, which is like, it seems to me like it's not something that, like, if when we die we go to heaven or hell, that's true independent of whether it would be horrible or boring. So like, if we do go to heaven when we die and it's boring, the fact that it's boring doesn't change whether or not it's true. So it seems to me like that's a conflation of like epistemological strangeness, like heaven is boring, and ontological truth, like heaven is real and we go there when we die. And the second thing would be like, we are finite mortal entities by definition. That's even from a Heideggerian perspective of a definition of being in the world. And it's not clear to me that it makes any sense for a finite mortal life form to make judgments about what eternity would be like, phenomenologically speaking, because in order to think about eternity, we have to think about it with categories of time. So, for example, Dawkins would say, wouldn't it be boring to be in heaven for 1 trillion years? But that's a temporal category. So you can't say being in heaven for trillions of years is anything related to the concept of being in heaven for an eternity, because 1 trillion years is still a temporal category. So I think we have the issue of, one, the limits of our own cognition in understanding what would be something of the transcendental order or something of the transcendental nature, where you're challenged to think outside of what Kant would call the a priori categories of space and time. Of course, Kant said we have a priori intuitions of space and time which structure our thinking, which structure our logical engagement with the world. Whether you agree with that or not, that's just a philosophical perspective. But if that's true, then you can't use the categories of space or time to talk about the ontological truth of something like heaven or something like eternity. So it seems to me that, again, there's a philosophical problem there that is not being taken seriously enough. And I haven't even gone into made-up stories, because you could say, for example, that evolutionary theory in some sense is a made-up story. In other words, it's constructed by human beings, like it was constructed by Charles Darwin, Alfred Russel Wallace, other evolutionary theorists. Now, it reflects some external reality, and what Dawkins is trying to get at is that a made-up story of religion might not reflect external reality, but that's not the point of the made-up story, because the made-up story for the religious mind is to reflect rather a existential condition. That the point of the story is, what it means is it's reflecting some perspective on reality, which is from the point of view of a finite mortal suffering entity. So it's a different kind of made-up story. And judging the made-up story based on the presuppositions of the point of the made-up evolutionary story is a different, again, it's a different problem. Then 816. Then it goes into more depth of this nature of eternity. Let's see.
100 years, but after that, no. I mean, I think that eternity is what's frightening about death, and eternity is best spent under a general anesthetic, which is what's going to happen.
So again, he's injecting his own view on his own epistemological point of view on what would be best for eternity. So like, what would be best for eternity is not to be experiencing it, but what would be best for eternity would be to be unconscious, essentially. And whether or not that's true or false, that's his opinion on how eternity should best be spent. But it doesn't help us understand any serious ontological questions about the nature of eternity. It's just his view on what would be best. But that doesn't necessarily is inscribed into to use the Hegelian term, it's not, we shouldn't presuppose that it's inscribed into the thing that that's the way eternity is. It's again, there's this confusion about epistemology and ontology here. And this is relevant to reflect on because the next point of their conversation goes into psychedelic experience, which would be the experience of eternity itself for many psychedelic practitioners. Let's see.
Yeah.
And I've never so far dared take her up on it.
How come?
I asked advice of a cousin of my father who's just recently died, who was a major expert on psychedelics, and I think he was the one who introduced Aldous Huxley to mescaline, for example. And he judiciously advised against, he said that the horrors of a bad trip are so awful that he wouldn't advise somebody to go into it. My friend who's offering me this trip says it would be a relatively low dose, and she would take another low dose so she could kind of accompany me.
Yeah.
And stop me jumping out a window or anything.
So he says that he won't do psychedelics because he's scared of a bad trip. But fear of learning about something that might be relevant to the topic you're discussing and the topic you've spent your life critiquing seems to me to disqualify you from being a serious it disqualifies you from serious engagement with the topic. I mean, again, the logic, like if I applied that same logic to physics or biology, say I had a fear of blood, but I wanted to critique the medical profession, and I spent my life critiquing the medical profession, but I had never gone through med school. I had never done, say, for example, the actual surgeries, or been exposed to cadavers, or been in environments where there's something very seriously wrong involving blood, and I would just be too fearful of that. That would disqualify me from making intellectual judgments on the profession because I hadn't exposed myself to the necessary content in order to understand the subject or in order to understand the practice. So for religious practitioners who are experimenting with altered states of consciousness, those are the types of people that we should listen to if we want to understand the spiritual or religious value of those altered states of consciousness. If someone is not willing to experience or experiment with those altered states of consciousness, that means that there's a huge part of the conversation, a huge part of the psychological reality that is important for understanding the topic, which you're not exposing yourself to. So it would seem to me like that's an important dimension that's being missed. And Joe Rogan actually brings this up a little later, where he asks them, wouldn't it be attractive for you to experiment with these because you're a very logical, rigorous thinking person?
Your toes in.
Yes. Well, don't you think the lights go out?
I don't know. I don't know. I've had some pretty profound psychedelic experiences that make me wonder what thoughts are and what consciousness is, and whether or not there's some way that it transcends.
Well, I wonder what consciousness is, but it's pretty clear that it's to do with brains, and brains decay, and so I wouldn't hold out much hope if I were you.
So there's a few things there. So one, of course, Rogan's saying here, wouldn't it be attractive for you to experiment with that? And then his only response is, but don't you agree with me that death is the end? And then Joe Rogan says, well, I don't know. Like in my experience with psychedelics, I've had some experiences about thought. I had some experiences related to my own thoughts and related to consciousness that make me wonder about maybe ontological categories like the eternal, or like the everlasting, or the immortal, or whatever the category it is you want to use to talk about these type of transcendent states. And then Richard Dawkins says, well, I know consciousness and thoughts are to do with the brains, and brains decay, so therefore I'm right to not experiment or explore with these experiences. But there's at least a conversation here that is worth not closing on from a philosophical point of view. Like, even if, and here I'll admit for me personally, like, even if I admit that the brain and the body have something essential to do with thinking and consciousness, I don't think that we can close the conversation about whether or not the totality of what thinking is or what consciousness are at least reducible to the material substrate, just purely from a phenomenological point of view. Like, because if you're going to say, for example, that someone's ayahuasca experience or someone's DMT experience is merely something which can be mapped neurologically, and that gives us the total picture of what these experiences are, it seems to me that totally misses the point, because the experiences in themselves, like the confrontation with it could be like say you have in the experience you have a confrontation with a dead loved one, or say you experience eternity, or say you experience being an all-knowing being, which are types of experiences which are common in psychedelic experience. It seems to me that the experiential value in itself has a causal relation to the development of a personality and the development of a human being, potentially on the level of values, potentially on the level of morals, potentially on the level of ethics, that has nothing to do with the neocortex pattern that is somehow correlated to a certain state. So I'm just here saying that there are interesting philosophical questions here that require more nuance and more complexity and more openness than simply consciousness and the brain are directly correlated to material and therefore and brains decay, so therefore these experiences mean nothing. It seems to me that precloses and presupposes far too much for an investigative, open mind to be confident with, or to be satisfied with, for a total picture of morals and values and ethics and so forth. At least that's my perspective. So 1311, Rogan asks him whether or not he's ever had a good debate about religion with anyone.
Not good points, no. I mean, I've had very amicable debates with religious people, bishops, archbishops, and people like that, the chief rabbi of Britain. Very amicable, and the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, is such a nice man and intelligent in the literal sense that he finishes your sentences for you. And so he clearly understands exactly what you're trying to say and gets there before you finish the sentence. But then for some weird reason doesn't agree with it.
That's a very interesting one. So, like, one, if you're if you've spent your entire life debating religious people from the point of view of atheism, and you feel like the other side has never made a good point, not one good point, that it seems to me like that's dogmatic. You know, like it seems to me that that's so anti-dialectical. It seems to me you can only have that point of view if you've gone into every debate not really wanting to learn about the other side, not really wanting to learn about the internal logic of the other side, but only wanting to reify and only wanting to reinstantiate your own point of view. And then the other weird thing is, like he said, I had debates with very intelligent bishops, and they understand my point of view and they understand they can finish my sentences, but for some weird reason they don't agree with me. And to me, for an inquiring mind, it would be like, why? Like, I want to get to the bottom. Why don't they agree with my point of view? It could be that there's something internal to my point of view which is lacking, that I haven't yet thought, that I haven't yet considered, which could change my point of view. Because, like, if someone who's very intelligent disagrees with you, and for some weird reason which you don't understand, they don't agree with you, it would lead me to believe that there's something lacking in my own point of view, that there's something I still need to investigate. So I don't really understand that. And then Rogan's response was like, isn't it weird how deeply intelligent people will believe everything about religion, that this is a mystery?
Would believe possibly in the resurrection because they regard that as a kind of non-negotiable part. What surprised me was that he turned out to believe in all the other miracles as well, which I thought sophisticated theologians just don't do. I thought they said, oh, that's just a metaphor, or it didn't really happen, or that's not important, just symbolic or something like that. But he really believes in the whole lot.
So then, the interesting thing here is when you understand, or at least when you're interested in the nature of the symbolic order, this question of whether things are metaphorical and symbolic, like when you say it's just a metaphor, or when you say it's just symbolic, that doesn't seem to me that we get at something very interesting, for example, about the nature of the metaphor or the nature of the symbolic. So when he's saying it didn't literally happen, that means it didn't physically happen. So, like, for example, Jesus being resurrected from the dead, for example, that didn't literally happen. It's just a metaphor, or it's just symbolic. But then isn't that interesting to think about from the perspective of human beings in language wrestling with questions about finitude and mortality? In other words, what does from a metaphorical perspective or from a symbolic perspective, like in a sophisticated theological sense, Dawkins' own words, what is the nature of that metaphor? What does that metaphor mean historically? Is that random? Is it random that huge, complex civilizations built their value system and their moral structure on the metaphor of Jesus rising from the dead? What does that mean? I think it's a very interesting question, which we probably don't have answers for, and certainly couldn't be answered within evolutionary biological scaffolding, because it's inherently the nature of a metaphor or the nature of the symbolic. So to me, that's an important dimension which is left out, and a limitation, I think, of a literalist minded view, which tends to de-emphasize the importance of metaphor and de-emphasize the importance of the symbolic, which are, of course, always already necessary for the formation of a scientific worldview. Like, for example, the clockwork universe in physics is a metaphor that grounds a certain body of symbolic knowledge, formulas and mathematical abstractions about the physical world. So then the conversation, I was going to skip to a point where Joe Rogan's asking him about the nature of belief systems and why are they so intrinsically attractive to people, which I think is a very interesting question. 1939.
I think I get it when there's childhood indoctrination involved, but in the case of Scientology, some of the celebrities who joined it, that's not childhood indoctrination, that's just sheer rank stupidity.
I think there's also an element of being a part of a tribe.
Yes.
That, especially the celebrity thing, because I've met quite a few of them out here, especially in the early days, the 90s, before the internet came along and sort of exposed a lot of this stuff, and South Park. Before they came along and exposed it, there was quite a few people that thought that there was a career advantage to being a part of Scientology. There were so many successful actors that were a part of Scientology, and they seemed to be disciplined and focused, and they were avoiding drugs and all the pitfalls of Hollywood fame and stardom. And they also seemed to be helping each other. That Hollywood directors who were also Scientologists would look towards hiring Scientologist producers and actors.
A kind of Freemasonry then.
Yes. There's some strange thing that we are all very attracted to being a part of a tribe and being a part of, even if the belief system is ridiculous, if we are in a group that subscribes this belief system, it's very attractive to people.
That's a very important point, and tribalism is a very important part of human nature, a very bad part, I think.
Yeah.
The
rewarding part as well,
Well,
right?
I suppose so. Steven Pinker, you probably had him on at some point. He makes the point that so much of what we believe, we humans generally believe, is not about evidence, but is about, is this part of my tribe?
Right.
Does my tribe believe this?
Yes.
Jonathan Haidt also makes the same point about Republicans and Democrats.
Yes.
There's a fierce tribalism going on, and it accounts for so much of what people believe, as opposed to actually looking at the evidence. The Centre for Inquiry, which my foundation has just merged with, is of course all about trying to get people off that sort of thing, sort of irrationality, and to instead evaluate claims on the basis of evidence, critically evaluated scientific evidence. But it's hard because people have other motives like emotion, tribalism, things like that.
Well,
So that was a long clip, but I think what's important about that is that, one, we come up with the question of the function of belief systems, and making value judgments on the function of belief systems. So it's clear that belief systems can have a negative dimension where they can blind us from certain truths and get us emotionally swept up into a certain way of thinking which has no correlation to any form of truth. And then there's also dimensions of belief systems which are very positive from the point of view of building a healthy social life, from the point of view of bonding with other people, from the point of view of just being pro-social and altruistic. And it could be that there are fundamental paradoxes here about the nature of belief systems and human social life, which are more complex and more nuanced than our current understanding of the history of religion allows us to approach. Like, so for example, like the first thing that pops up in my mind is two main things, is that if you are an evolutionist and you are dedicating your entire life to studying evolution, you also are a part of a tribe. You also are a part of a community, and you also care what they think, and you care what they think about you. And that's irreducibly a part of being a human, social, emotional being. And that also, if science and evolution are not the only way of, as it's currently constructed, aren't the only way of seeing the world, then that emotional dimension and that social dimension could also prevent you from seeing certain truths which are of a different order or which are of a different dimension. So, for example, he says that his institute is supporting critique and evidence-based thinking. But if you're supporting critique and evidence-based thinking, then shouldn't that same process apply to what we previously discussed about phenomenological evidence of psychedelic experience, for example, or evidence-based thinking about the pro-social and the positive communal benefits of belief? Shouldn't we approach those things in a critical, evidence-based way? And that if we're not capable of approaching those things in a critical, evidence-based way, that it could be that there's something emotional about our tribal identification which is preventing us from exploring those topics. It seems to me like, at least at this point, there is a fundamental inconsistency or paradox with the desire to build a worldview on critique and evidence and a desire to stay away from emotions and tribalism, which is here intersecting at this dimension of being capable of approaching religion from a more scientific point of view, and to understand maybe, the psychological, the cognitive dimensions of why someone would gravitate towards religion. So I'm going to skip here to a point where Rogan asks him about, has there ever been a civilization that has existed without belief in a higher power? Which is a very interesting question.
Belief in a higher power?
I don't think there has, no. Of course, there are plenty of individuals who educate them to not believe in a higher power. But I think probably true to say that every anthropologists might deny them. There might be some tribe that doesn't, but I suspect they all do.
Well,
so that's huge. So, to me, if we're being empiricists and we're being critical, isn't that an interesting question? I'm very open. What does that mean? Is if every civilization has existed with belief in a higher power, and civilization is an incredibly improbable, incredibly complex system, given the whatever laws of thermodynamics, then isn't it interesting that all of them without failure have included belief in a higher power? It would seem to me that there is from an evolutionarist point of view, it seems to me there's a selective advantage for some belief system and some higher power that transcends the individual or transcends a sort of egoistic view of self. And then he was saying there might be individuals within that society that educate themselves not to believe in a higher power. But the society as a whole stays together and functions because of this belief in a higher power. I just think there's an incredibly complex dynamic going here. Do we really just being humble, do we really understand what's going on there? What do we mean, and how do we define belief in a higher power, and what type of higher power, and all these types of questions? To me, they're very open questions, especially from someone who comes from a psychoanalytic point of view, because I guess from a psychoanalytic point of view, the structure of our psyches and the structure of our egos and the structure of us as individuals is inherently that we don't understand ourselves too well, and actually there's forces inside of ourselves, the unconscious, whether the id or other dimensions, that are more powerful than us and actually determining us. So this idea of a higher power is something that I think requires a very sophisticated psychological analysis, essentially. But then Rogan asks him, do you envision a time when humanity will have eradicated all irrational belief systems?
On fact.
I do. I'm not sure that it'll come soon, but I do, and I look forward to that time, of course. I think we're moving in the right direction, and the figures bear that out. Even in America, which is off the scale of Western civilizations. Even in America, the number of people who now subscribe to a religion is dropping dramatically, and the number who say they have no religion is now about 25%. That's a lot. That's a great deal. And that compares to any one particular Christian denomination. And yet, politically, that group, the nuns, the no beliefs, have no lobby. They have no powerful pressure group. So politicians will go out there and suck up to, I don't know, the Irish lobby, the Polish lobby, the Jewish lobby, the Catholic lobby, etc. But the atheist lobby hasn't got his act together, or is only just now beginning to get his act together.
So it's interesting, like he just finished agreeing that there's been no civilization that has existed without belief in a higher power. But he still believes that there will be a time when all of human civilization exists without belief in a higher power. But I don't know then how that is a belief system that's grounded in evidence or critical thinking. It would seem to me the opposite. Because if we're based on evidence and critical thinking, then belief in a higher power seems to be some sort of important social function, and it's just where is the belief that humanity will one day exist without belief in a higher power? Where does that belief come from, and what is the evidence supporting it? Those would be my first questions, and I think tying into that, I'd like to go to a part in this interview where they start talking about where do ethics and morals actually come from, because that's ultimately what this function of the higher power seems to be about in some sense.
A difficult question. We clearly don't get them from religion, and yet we get them from somewhere, and you can demonstrate that by the fact that the moral values of any particular century are markedly different from those of other centuries, even decades. So in the 21st century, we here now have moral values which are really significantly different from 100 years ago, or 200 years ago, or 300 years ago. And within any one of those centuries, you could take people who are in the vanguard of moral progress. For example, in the 19th century, Abraham Lincoln, Charles Darwin, T.H. Huxley would have been on the liberal, progressive end of the spectrum, and other people would have been on the opposite end. But even Abraham Lincoln, for example, made a speech that I quoted in Outgrowing God, in which he said, of course, nobody would seriously think that black people are the equal of white people. Nobody would seriously say that black people should be allowed to vote or should be allowed to marry white people. This is Abraham Lincoln, who freed the slaves,
Right.
and was, as I say, in the forefront of progressive thought. Charles Darwin, again, was in favor of freeing the slaves. He was passionately anti-slavery, but he too thought that there was no question about black people being the equal of white people. They obviously weren't. And Huxley, Thomas Huxley, again, Darwin's bulldog, thought the same way. Now those people were at the forefront, as I say. Today, they would still be in the forefront, and they would be horrified to look back on what they said in the 19th century. Well, something is changing as the centuries go by. In Outgrowing God, I call it something in the air, which of course doesn't explain anything. But what I mean by that is that it's not literally hovering in the air, but it's a collection of conversations between people, dinner party conversations, parliamentary decisions, congressional debates, judicial decisions by judges, juries, newspaper articles, journalism. All these things together conspire together to produce something in the air, something that defines a given century, or maybe even a given decade, with the moral values of that decade.
So, again, that was a long clip, but I just wanted to show the full argument of where ethics and morals come from. And he admits it's a profoundly difficult question, and then suggests that moral systems and ethical systems evolve across time as historical phenomena. And of course, that is a particularly interesting way to view morality, precisely because in the Platonic tradition, morality is seen as some sort of transcendental truth which in and of itself doesn't change. That what is moral is more, like what is universally moral is moral in every universe. And we can critique and we can debate whether or not that's true or false. But here Dawkins is presupposing or trying to develop here some sort of evolutionary view of morality, that morality is radically dependent on the relations that constitute and govern a certain social system through communication channels and through different forms of media, and that there's some sort of progressive telos to the whole structure, that say the arc of history is bending towards more moral progress, or bending towards more morally righteous or just systems. But then it would seem to me that if that's true, then that the religious systems which were a part of that transformation historically, from tribal organizations to agricultural organizations and to industrial organizations, at least played some vital evolutionary function. That if they were on the whole bad for moral development, if they were on the whole bad for ethical development, then why would they have been selected for and used to ground certain moral codes, even if they need to be evolved, even if they need to be updated in the present day? That it seems to me like even if you have an evolutionary view of religion, you have to be able to think about religion as a evolutionary phenomenon which has a certain evolutionary logic. Otherwise, it wouldn't have appeared in the first place, I would suggest. And I don't know, for example, if that means that certain religious institutions were necessary historically, but now we can sort of shed them, that they were a type of moral scaffolding that we don't need once we've developed more individual awareness, or once we've developed more individual emotional competence. To me, that would be an open question, and just an interesting way to think about, well, what would be the future then of spirituality, or what would be the future then of what we have called religions. And then that brings us to a point where Joe Rogan starts talking about, do we need secular religious, or secular groups that mimic what religions did in the past?
I don't feel that very strongly myself, but I'm aware that many other people do, and there are people who are interested in starting up sort of atheistic or secular meet-up groups on Sundays and lectures.
Yeah, my worry is that will become a sex cult.
Yes, I never thought of that.
Always seems to have someone who gets in control, who winds up having
as religious cults usually do. I mean, there's extraordinary stories. That awful man, what was he called, who ended up taking his followers to a South American jungle, and
Jim Jones.
Yeah. And I mean, he had this gigantic harem of all the young women.
They always do.
Yes.
Waco, he had one.
Exactly.
They all do.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, okay. I mean, I don't think that's happening so far with the secular.
I hope not.
Ones.
The worry is that once someone gets into a position of being the person who gets to speak, the alpha, the one who's on the, on the stage addressing people and giving them the doctrine, that he becomes far too attractive for his own good.
Well, that would not surprise any naive Darwinian who would say, what on earth do you think you become, the dominant chimpanzee becomes dominant for?
Right.
That's what it's all about.
Exactly.
So that's very interesting, because there is a desire within atheist communities for secular structures which mimic religious function. So in other words, even if you're intellectually an atheist, there's still a strong desire for a social function which would mimic what religions did, which is already an interesting example of how you can't just through intellectual abstraction alone and through scientific reasoning alone, you can't get rid of the fact that we are social emotional beings that need some sort of social group, some social cohesion that takes on the form of something that looks kind of religious. And then the first thing Rogan suggests is that one of the biggest problems in these secular groups would be that it turns into a sex cult, and that even Dawkins agrees that from a Darwinian point of view, that would be the biggest problem, because you would want to get the attention by being the center of a group, of a presumably important social group. You would get advantages for your survival and your reproductive purposes. So not only do we already have an emerging evolutionary understanding of why religions would emerge, but it's totally logical, and it's totally in response to fundamental problems that ancient humans would have had. For example, distribution of sexual partners and forming a cohesive community which would function across decades and across centuries. So it seems to me that when you see how secular types of religious groups emerge within atheist thought communities, that we encounter here a paradox of our own embodied historical existence, which is often not taken into consideration enough when you're only considering things from an abstract intellectual point of view. And when you think about the practical necessities of dealing with our sexual nature, or when you think about dealing with the practical necessities of organizing a social community that has existential meaning and purpose for all the members of the community in order for them to be psychologically healthy individuals, it might be that religions provided an essential symbolic function. It could be that religions provided an essential metaphorical function, which we wouldn't have been able to cope with the suffering and the vicissitudes of history without. At least it seems to me from that perspective that it's part of the explanation. And even here Dawkins goes into a little bit of his view on this in regards to Jesus as a moral scaffolding. So let me just go to that.
Well, Jesus would probably on the whole provide a fairly good moral scaffolding. Not totally, but
right.
He was ahead of his time anyway.
So you do think he was a real person?
Most of the scholars I've talked to say he probably was. The evidence is not great, of course, but I think I don't think it's that big a deal actually, because a wandering preacher called Yeshua or Yehoshua would not be surprising. It's a common name,
right.
And there are plenty of wandering preachers. What would be very surprising would be if he raised Lazarus from the dead and walked on water and turned water into wine. And that, of course, did not happen.
Okay, so one, he admits Jesus would be a good moral scaffolding, although in his view, not a totally good moral scaffolding. So the point is that Jesus as a symbol, Jesus as a moral guidance principle, embodies many morals and values which make sense for ancient peoples. In other words, they make sense for the people of the time who were living in the conditions they were living in. So it's not illogical. It's not, it's even evolutionarily, it could have obviously been evolutionarily beneficial. And then again, we run into this question of literal versus metaphorical. And here, interesting questions emerge if you're thinking from a metaphorical point of view. So even like if you just say, okay, he literally didn't do miracles, and that's what he's concerned about. But if we're thinking about the probability of someone of this nature existing at this time who becomes codified in certain stories which become evolutionarily beneficial to these social communities, then it's interesting to think about what does it mean that human beings are attracted to and gravitate towards the idea of an individual who is capable of, in some sense, transcending or in some sense breaking physical laws or physical determinations. It would seem to me that there's something inherent in the metaphor, there's something inherent in the symbol which is attractive to human beings spontaneously in breaking laws, in breaking physical constraints. And you could even make the argument that in the metaphors and the symbolism of science, these types of things emerge as well. And in many emergentist scientific views, it's not that any of our symbolic orders and our technologies and our consciousnesses break physical laws, but that our activity is not reducible totally to physical laws, and that there are technological possibilities of expanding or dramatically extending our abilities as conscious beings to do things which would be unimaginable to historical peoples. I mean, we're doing that right now on the internet. So I'm just saying here, when you think about these things with nuance and complexity, it's not so black and white that religion is stupid, Jesus is stupid, the ideas are stupid. It seems to me that it's that we don't understand ourselves that well, and that we need a proper understanding of psychology, we need a proper understanding of language, we need a proper understanding of history, as in a theoretical sense, which evolutionary biology runs up to things that look strange from the point of view of an evolutionary biologist. Let me here just go on to then another interesting thing when we start talking about the embodied historical reality of Richard Dawkins, and he admits that I'm a cultural Christian, for example.
I understand that. I think especially for people of Jewish heritage who have relatives killed in the Holocaust, I think it could be a matter of kind of loyalty to their murdered relatives. I could easily get that. And I think that there are probably cultural Muslims who probably not for the same degree of loyalty, but clearly think of themselves as Muslims. I suppose I'm a cultural Anglican in a way. I mean, I sort of, I can sing the hymns, and my family observes Christmas in a desultory sort of way.
When someone sneezes, do you say blood?
So the interesting thing about that is that not only can he see the logic in culturally identifying as religious, and he can see the cultural logic in identifying as Jewish or as Muslim, as a type of social function or as a type of musical function. He was saying, like, we could sing the hymns and I could go to church and I could enjoy the aesthetics and I could enjoy the environment. That's precisely the dimension that needs an explanation on the level of consciousness, on the level of language, on the level of historical embodied identity, of dealing with historical emotional problems. That we are not just these scientists in a vat. We are not just these abstract intellectual entities reflecting nature. We're historical beings that are transforming in nature, which are transforming in societies, which have existential problems, which have duties to other people, which have moral responsibilities, and all of those things are approaching things that people in the past would have called and needed as religious structures. So it doesn't seem to me to be again so cut and dry. Now we get into an interesting scientific and philosophical territory where we're talking about why people struggle to understand evolution. And I think that by getting into this topic, we approach maybe the core issue for Dawkins.
For it to not be of the divine.
Well, I'm not sure it's weird. It's kind of understandable until you thought about it for a bit, because complicated things don't just happen. Complicated things like these cameras and this computer and things like that, we all know they had to have an engineer design them and factories to build them. And they're very, very improbable things, statistically improbable. The components of a computer or a camera, if you jumble them up at random, they wouldn't work, obviously. So it's kind of pardonable that people should think there must have been a designer. But then you think a bit further, and then you realize that the designer himself would need just the same kind of explanation. And therefore the designer is not an explanation that flies. And I mean, philosophers before Darwin, philosophers like Hume realized that, but didn't have anything to put in its place. Darwin came along and gave them that which you would need to put in its place. And Hume would have loved Darwin if only he'd lived long enough to meet him.
So there's a lot there, but just his logic is that we need evolutionary theory to understand the complexity of the world, and that if you don't live in a world where evolutionary theory is well developed, then it's logical to believe that that it must have been designed, because complex things don't just happen, they're improbable. So evolutionary theory is about explaining what appears to be the improbability of the complexity of the world around us, and it does a fantastic job of doing that. But then he then uses that and juxtaposes it against the fundamental problem for theological thinkers of thinking that the world was designed, and that the problem with that is that you run into an infinite regress, is that the designer needs an explanation. Now, of course, that's an extremely difficult philosophical problem, because even in the evolutionary worldview, like if you're in understanding the evolutionary worldview as a chain of cause and effect, where the past has caused the present, and that the past can be explained through evolutionary mechanisms. And even if you think that natural selection can be extended beyond the biological world into the chemical world, or at least some form of these selection mechanisms can be extended into the chemical world and into the physical world, you eventually get to the Big Bang, which is a point where everything emerged from nothing, according to some physicists, or at least everything emerged from a singularity, and basically the laws of physics break down and we don't know what happened. So again, we have to say, there has to be more humility, there has to be more acceptance that we simply don't know how everything came into being, and it may not be a god, but we don't have a explanation which is empirical, because the multiverse is not an empirical theory. So we run into problems. And so all I'm saying here is that this is a very complex and very difficult philosophical territory, and this is why Richard Dawkins brings up a philosopher. He brings up David Hume and says Charles Darwin would have loved him. And of course, David Hume is famous for introducing problems of causality of this nature into philosophical discussion. But what's interesting is that, at least in the traditions that I'm more familiar with, starting with Kant and basically dealing with German idealism, which grow out of David Hume's work and criticisms. We start to ask questions not about the universal structure of being, but about the a priori appearance of being itself. So that's basically Kant's transcendental categories, and the idea that space and time are not out there, but they're actually concepts that we use to organize our understanding of out there. And even the notion of causality is an idea that humans develop in order to come up with a deterministic order of things which has explanatory value. So all I'm saying is that when you work through the idealist tradition and when you work through this philosophical territory, there are very interesting questions about the nature of the observer and the observed. There are very interesting questions about infinity and finitude, which require a lot more thinking. And I think here Dawkins, at least, is an interesting person to tarry with in this territory, but certainly doesn't have the final word or the final answer on these questions of infinite regress and the problem of the observer and problem of the nature of causality and determinism and all of these things. They require very sophisticated philosophical analysis, which is, again, would not be the enough time for me to go into all those details in the course of this video. But we can keep talking about it because it is important to consider, and is something they continue to philosophically debate.
Establish these ideas for them.
It's actually a very simple idea, but it plays out in very complex ways. And I think the main problem from a didactic point of view is that the results are so complex that it's hard to believe that anything so simple as natural selection, non-random selection of randomly varying genes could really be responsible for producing something as complicated as a human body. And so it's a matter of getting around, beating that barrier of incredulity. If the idea was more complex, in a way it might be easier. That's the fact that the idea is so simple. I think that may be why it took so long for a Darwin to come on the scene. When you think about it, the middle of the 19th century is rather late. 200 years after Newton did, on the face of it, much cleverer things, and yet it was another 200 years after Newton before Darwin came along. I think the reason for that is that the idea is just too simple. It's almost ridiculously simple to be big enough to achieve the feat of explaining the complexity of any part of an animal, really, but let alone a whole animal.
So basically, to go into the philosophy of that, what I take away from that, the importance of that, is that evolution is such a successful idea at explaining the world and explaining the complexity of the world. But for so much of human history, we simply didn't understand how evolution could occur. And it took a genius to come up with a very simple idea which had great explanatory power. And my question here, and I think there's good reason if you situate this question in the context of this whole video, is that if we're committed to reason, and if we're committed to critique, and if we're committed to evidence, isn't it possible that we don't understand religion? Isn't it possible that we don't understand our psychologies? Isn't it possible that we don't understand society and history and language and technology? And that this complexity requires the intervention of a similarly simple, brilliant idea, which would retroactively transform the way we think about these things. Because if it's clear to me from this video is that I know Dawkins doesn't like religion and spent his whole life critiquing religion, but it also seems to me that there are several important questions and several important dimensions of religion which he simply doesn't understand, and then inscribes the lack into religion itself instead of being open and critical and empirically minded in regards to these. And then there are fundamental philosophical problems of infinity, of observers, of the appearance of reality itself, which seem to require a new theory, which seem to require a new explanation for the world, which may include or which may transcend evolution. We don't know, or who knows? No one knows. But in any case, I think this is a good place for me to end the video. Simply because the rest of their conversation is mostly just about his book Outgrowing God, and then it ends there. So I can end there, and I hope that this was a useful experiment. I hope that, my goal here was to be, open, critically minded, and just someone who's working through some of these problems in a very honest way, and using this conversation here as a dialectical method to explore some of the dimensions where a science of religion or a new philosophy of religion could become possible, and using these hard critiques as a dialectical weapon to try and think new knowledge and try to think in new territories, and hopefully that was beneficial. And I would be very interested to engage in the comments if any of you are intellectually stimulated by this method. So thanks for watching if you're still with me.